Chapter 30, James 1688, by Charles Oman. No greater testimony to the caution and cleverness of Charles II can be given than the fact that, after a reign of 25 stormy years, he died in possession of a very considerable measure of absolute power, having lived down his troubles, secured the devotion of the larger half of the nation, strengthened himself with a standing army, and dispensed for 3 years with any summons of Parliament. His successor was to prove that a man without tact and pliability, pursuing the same schemes for the restoration of arbitrary government and Romanism, might wreck himself in 3 years and die in exile. Yet James of York was in many ways a stronger and a better man than Charles II. He possessed conscience and courage in a far greater measure than his brother. His life was not an open scandal. His word could be relied upon. His attachment to his faith was devoted and sincere. But he had 3 ruinous faults. He was obstinate to blindness. Long after a fact had become patent to all men, he would refuse to recognize its existence. He was full of a bigoted self-sufficiency that arose from an overweening belief in his own good intentions and wisdom. Lastly, he was a man unable to forgive or forget. There was no drop of mercy in his composition. He could understand nothing but the letter of the law. Blind, conceited, pitiless, he was bound to win the hatred of all who differed from him, and it was soon to be discovered that 9/10 of the English nation were numbered in that class. James was a man of business and method, as well as a man of PG 437 action. He had commanded a fleet with credit in the Dutch War. He had presided with success at the Admiralty till he was compelled to resign that office by the Test Act. He had ruled Scotland for a time with a very firm, if a rigid, hand. But no amount of mere administrative ability could make up for his entire want of judgment, foresight, and geniality. Yet on his accession, the new king had everything in his favor. The Tory party was still in the ascendancy, which it had enjoyed ever since the Whigs had been discredited by the Rye House plot. It was resolved to trust and support James as long as he behaved in a constitutional manner, and had a strong confidence in his honesty. Accordingly, the King's first Parliament granted him the liberal income of £1,900,000 a year, and protested its complete reliance on his wisdom and good intentions. Nor was any objection made when James sought out and punished the informers who had fabricated the Popish plot, though their chastisement was very barbarous. Oates, their chief, received lashes twice within 48 hours, yet survived, in spite of a sentence which had obviously been intended to kill him. The first real shock to the confidence of the nation in the king was caused by the cruelty with which he put down an insurrection which broke out against him in the summer that followed his accession. The late king's bastard son, James, Duke of Monmouth, the tool of Shaftesbury in 1680, was living in exile in Holland, along with many violent Whigs, who were charged, truly or falsely, with participation in the Rye House plot. Monmouth, a vain and presumptuous young man, could not read the signs of the times, and thought that all England would rise to overturn a Romanist king if only a Protestant leader presented himself to lead the people. Without securing any tangible promises of support from the chiefs of the Whig party in England, he resolved to attempt an invasion. He was to be aided by Archibald, Earl of Argyll, the exiled chief of the Scottish Covenanters, who undertook to stir up a rising among his clansmen in the Highlands. Argyll landed in Scotland in May 1685. Monmouth came ashore at Lyme, in Dorsetshire, in June. Each had brought a very small force with him, and relied wholly on the support PG 438 he hoped to find at home. Argyll raised the Campbells, but found none else to join him. After a few days his men dispersed, and he was taken and beheaded. Monmouth was at first more fortunate. He was well known and popular in Dorset and Somerset, and some thousands of countrymen came flocking to his banner, though none of the gentry would adhere to such a reckless adventurer. The Duke appealed to all Protestants to aid him against a Papist king, declared that his mother had been the lawful wife of Charles Roman II, and claimed the crown of England. But his proclamation did him no good, and his army of ploughmen and miners was but a half-armed rabble. Nevertheless, they fought bravely enough against James's regulars at Sedgemoor, July 5, 1685, and only dispersed when their leader fled in craven fear from the field. Monmouth was caught in disguise and taken to London. He grovelled at the feet of James and offered to submit to any indignity if his life might be spared. But the pitiless king, after chiding him for half an hour, sent him to the scaffold. His fate provoked little sympathy, for he had clearly brought his trouble on his own head. But the cruel punishment that was dealt out to the poor ignorant peasants who had followed him shocked the whole nation. Hundreds of rebels taken in arms were hung, or shot after a summary court-martial by the brutal Colonel Kirke, a veteran who had learnt ferocity by serving against the Moors in Africa. After the summary executions were over, Judge Jeffreys, a clever but worthless lawyer, whom the king made the chief instrument of his cruelties, descended on the southwestern counties. In the bloody assize, as his circuit was called, he put to death more than 300 persons, after the barest mockery of a trial, and sent 1,000 more to work as slaves on the plantations of Jamaica and Barbados. Of all Jeffreys' judicial murders, the worst was that of the aged Lady Lisle. For having sheltered a fugitive from Sedgemoor, she was sentenced by this barbarian to be burnt, and he thought it an act of clemency when he commuted the penalty to beheading, September 1685. The ease with which he had crushed the rising of Monmouth and Argyll emboldened James to take seriously in hand the great project of his life, the restoration of Romanism. His plan PG 439 was to fill all offices in church and state with open or secret papists, and to overawe discontent by the muskets of a large standing army. That such a plan was dangerous, and even impossible, when 9/10 of the nation was devotedly attached to Protestantism, he does not seem to have realized. He relied on his observations of the men about his own person, for many of the demoralized courtiers of Charles II were quite ready to become Romanists if only it brought them preferment. They would probably have become Jews or Moslems if it had been made worth their while. The basest of these degraded opportunists was James's chief minister, Lord Sunderland, the tool of all his worst acts of tyranny and folly. With such a man as his chief adviser and the infamous Jeffreys, now made Lord Chancellor, as his chief executioner, the king was likely to go to any lengths. Of his other councillors the chief were Richard Talbot, Earl of Tyrconnell, a bigoted Irish Romanist of very depraved manners, and Father Petter, a Jesuit priest. James commenced his campaign against Protestantism in 1686. The chief bar to the admission of papists to office in the public service and the army was the Test Act of 1673, which excluded all save English churchmen from any post in the state. Knowing that no parliament would repeal this act, James resolved to annul it on his own authority. One of the oldest weapons of the Stuarts was the claim to a dispensing power, a right of the king to grant immunity on his own authority for offences against the law of the land. This was the tool which he had now resolved to employ against the Test Act. He appointed a Romanist named Sir Edward Hales colonel of one of the new regiments, which he was busily employed in raising. Hales was prosecuted for illegally accepting the commission, and pleaded in defense that the king had dispensed him from taking the test. The case was brought before a bench of judges carefully packed by the orders of James, and they gave the wholly unconstitutional decision that the king's dispensation covered Hales from all penalties. Armed with this opinion of the judges, James began to give place and office to Romanists right and left. They were made judges, officers, sheriffs, lord lieutenants, mayors, all by virtue of the king's dispensing power. None but Catholics could for the future hope for any preferment. The king next proceeded to attack the Church of England. Once more pleading his dispensing power, he began to give papists office in the church. Not only did he make over crown livings to them, but he filled 2 vacant headships of Oxford colleges with notorious Romanists, showing thereby his intention to put the control of education into the hands of his own coreligionists. Somewhat later, he expelled the whole body of fellows and scholars of Magdalen College for refusing to receive the president whom he had chosen for them, herein following the example of Charles, who had deprived the philosopher John Locke of his studentship at Christ Church for holding Whig opinions. To deal with things religious, James revived the Court of High Commission, one of the old despotic courts which the Long Parliament had abolished 40 years before. He placed Jeffreys at its head, and used it for the oppression of all clergy who showed signs of opposing him. Meanwhile, a large army, including several Irish regiments, was concentrated at Hounslow to overawe London. The nation, though sorely tried by these exhibitions of James's high-handed bigotry, required still further provocation before it rose against him. The Tory party were so deeply committed to the doctrine of divine right and passive obedience that it required an even more desperate attack on the Church of England to set them in arms against the king. The Whigs were so crushed and depressed that they had not the heart to rebel. It may be added that the fact that the king was an elderly man, while his heiress Mary, Princess of Orange, was a firm Protestant, kept many men quiet. They held that the king must die ere long, and that his wild schemes would die with him. James began to embark on his last fatal measures of arbitrary power in the spring of 1688. Without calling or consulting a parliament, he determined to issue on his own authority a declaration of indulgence, which was to suspend all laws that were directed against Romanists. To partly cloak his plan, he added that the declaration was also to free the Protestant dissenters from the Penal Code of 1664-5. Toleration in itself is good, but toleration imposed by an autocratic and illegal mandate is a suspicious boon. The dissenters themselves repudiated the gift, when PG 441 given from such doubtful hands. To show his complete mastery over the Church of England, James ordered that the declaration should be publicly read from the pulpit by every beneficed minister in the land. This command provoked even the loyal Tories to resistance. When the appointed day came round, the clergy, almost without exception, refused to read the declaration. The Archbishop, William Sancroft, and 6 of his suffragans addressed a petition to the king begging that they might be excused from having to issue such a document. James was furious, and in his rage declared his intention of putting the bishops on trial for publishing a seditious libel, a most absurd description of their modestly worded plea. The 7 prelates were arrested and sent as prisoners to the Tower. A month later they were brought before the Court of King's Bench. The whole nation was in agony as to their fate, but the preposterous nature of the prosecution abashed even the king's subservient judges. The charge was pressed in a half-hearted way, and the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. James's vexation at this acquittal was only surpassed by his outburst of wrath when he saw the universal demonstration of joy with which the news was received. Even his own soldiery in the camp at Hounslow lighted bonfires to celebrate the event. In the very month of the acquittal of the 7 bishops, an event happened which profoundly affected the king's prospects. His young second wife, Mary of Modena, bore him a son, the prince afterwards known as the Old Pretender, June 10, 1688. The birth of this child gave the king a Romanist heir and cut the Princess of Orange out of the succession to the throne. This unexpected news filled England with dismay. It was evident that the king's schemes were no longer to be terminated with his own life. A dynasty of Romanists loomed on the horizon. In their wrath, many men asserted that the child was supposititious, a changeling foisted on the nation by the king's malice. This groundless tale received much credit, for anything was believed possible in such a bigot as James. The birth of the Prince of Wales was immediately followed by the formation of a serious conspiracy to overthrow the king. The Tories forgot their loyalty and joined the Whigs. The first sketch of the plot was drawn up by the old Tory minister, Danby, in conjunction with the Earl of Devonshire, the chief of the Whigs, and Henry Sidney and Edward Russell, the kinsmen of the 2 Whig leaders of those names who had been beheaded by Charles II. In 1683, their plan was to call over to England the Princess Mary and her husband the Prince of Orange and set them up against the king. William of Orange, the champion of Protestantism on the continent and the deadly foe of James's ally, the King of France, was known to be ready to strike any blow that would bring England over to his side. He had long been in secret communication with many leading men among the Whigs and welcomed the appearance of a definite invitation with joy. On receiving satisfactory assurances of support, he consented to raise every man that he could put into the field and to cross to England. James at first received the news of suspicious warlike preparations in Holland with indifference. He relied on the fact that William was at war with France, and reasoned that while the Low Countries were threatened by French troops, his son-in-law would never dare to leave his own country unprotected and invade England. But the French king was more set on an invasion of Germany than on the conquest of Holland, and when Louis sent his armies across the Upper Rhine, William was left unwatched and was able to make his preparations at leisure. Many Englishmen of mark, Tories as well as Whigs, slipped over to join him and bade him strike as quickly as possible. Though the storms of autumn were already raging, the prince set sail from Helvoetsluis on the 2nd of November and steered down the channel with 50 men of war and transports carrying some 13,000 men. James had a much larger force garrisoning the south of England. Combining his regular army with a number of newly raised regiments of Irish Romanists, he had quite 40,000 men under arms. But he soon discovered that the temper of the greater part of them was very bad. Except the numerous Catholic officers to whom he had given commissions, there was hardly a man who could be trusted. When the news of William's final preparations reached England, James was suddenly struck by a panic as irrational as his previous overconfidence. He fell from blind arrogance into extreme depression when he at last realized the universal discontent which his acts had created. With a craven and useless haste, he suddenly began to endeavor to undo his policy of the last 3 years. He abolished the Court of High Commission, cancelled the appointments of many Romanist officials, recalled the fellows whom he had banished from Oxford, and made the most profuse promises to respect all the rights and privileges of the Church of England for the future. But such conduct could not restore confidence. He could not make men forget the cruelties of the bloody assize, or the indignities which he had heaped on the 7 bishops. Such a repentance at the 11th hour deceived nobody. On the 5th of November, 1688, William of Orange landed at Torbay, and 3 days later he seized Exeter. James, who had looked for an invasion on the eastern coast, at once began to march his numerous army towards Devonshire. There was a moment's pause ere the opponents met. For some days no one of note joined the Prince of Orange, and it seemed doubtful if those who had pledged themselves to his cause were about to keep their promise. But the hesitation was not for long. Ere a shot had been fired in the west, insurrections began to break out in all the parts of England where the king had no armed force in garrison. Lord Danby seized York and the Earl of Devonshire Nottingham, but this was not the worst. As James advanced westward, first single officers, then whole companies and regiments began to slink away from his host and join the enemy. Even those whom he most trusted left him. His own son-in-law, Prince George of Denmark, the husband of his younger daughter Anne, was one of those who absconded. Another was one of his most trusted officers, John Churchill, afterwards the famous Duke of Marlborough. With abominable treachery, Churchill tried to kidnap his master before deserting, and almost succeeded in the attempt. Seeing his whole army melting away, James hastily returned to London, strove in vain to gain time by negotiating with the PG 444 Prince of Orange, and then sent off his wife and son to France, and endeavoured to follow them himself. He was stopped by a mob at Faversham, in Kent, and forced back to the capital. But no one wished to keep him a prisoner, and with the secret connivance of William of Orange, he was allowed to escape a second time, and to get clear away to France December 18, 1688. Thus ended in ignominious flight the preposterous attempt of a blind and arrogant king to coerce England into surrendering its constitution and its religion. The edifice which James had so laboriously reared crumbled to pieces at the first touch of force from without. Their names were Ken of Bath and Wells, White of Peterborough, Lloyd of St. Asaph, Trelawney of Bristol, Lake of Chichester, and Turner of Ely.